In the frozen skies over occupied Europe, during the winter of 1943, the mighty Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress was supposed to be the symbol of American air power, a machine so bristling with guns, armor, and courage that it promised its crews a fighting chance against the Luftwaffe. But for the young men who climbed into these bombers each morning, reality was far from heroic. From the airfields of England to the flak-filled corridors over Germany, death came swiftly, mercilessly, and in numbers that stunned even the most hardened commanders. The B-17, the pride of the U.S. Army Air Forces, was earning a grim new reputation, not as a flying fortress, but as a flying coffin. At the height of the daylight bombing campaign, entire formations of American bombers were being torn from the sky. In early 1943, casualty rates among bomber crews reached an unthinkable 73%. Out of every 100 airmen who took off, barely 27 would live to complete a tour. For most, that meant their war would end not in triumph, but in flames over Germany. The problem wasn't courage, it was design. The B-17 was strong, yes, with its aluminum skeleton and 4 reliable Wright Cyclone engines, but it was never meant to fight the kind of war that evolved above Europe. You see, when Boeing engineers designed the first B-17 prototypes in the late 1930s, they imagined enemy fighters diving from above or attacking from behind. They built gun positions in the nose, in the tail, and even along the top and bottom of the fuselage, but the sides? Those were an afterthought. When the bomber went into mass production, 2 small rectangular windows were cut into the fuselage, one on each side, where waist gunners would stand shoulder to shoulder, their .50 caliber Brownings aimed through open air, exposed to the freezing wind and the chaos of combat. It looked impressive on paper. But in practice, it was a deadly mistake. As Luftwaffe fighters began attacking from the sides, particularly the deadly Focke-Wulf FW-190s and Messerschmitt Bf-109s, the waist gunners realized a horrifying truth: they couldn't both fire at the same time. Their windows were directly opposite each other, meaning that if the right side gunner fired, the hot brass and recoil would slam directly into the gunner across the fuselage. They literally had to take turns defending the bomber, alternating bursts while enemy fighters screamed in from both sides. And when seconds meant survival, that hesitation often proved fatal. This was the brutal reality of early B-17 missions. The Flying Fortress wasn't living up to its name. Crews were being cut down in droves. For every mission that reached its target, another limped home on 2 engines, riddled with holes, smoke trailing, hydraulics gone. For others, there was no homecoming, just fireballs disappearing into the clouds. By March 1943, the 8th Air Force had suffered such catastrophic losses that commanders began questioning whether daylight precision bombing could continue at all. But rather than give up, American engineers and airmen decided to fight back, not just in the skies, but on the drawing board. The solution, as history would show, wouldn't come from the engineers at Boeing's Seattle headquarters, nor from the brass in Washington. It would come from the very men who flew the missions, who bled over Europe, and who understood better than anyone where the B-17 was failing them. One of those ideas came in the form of an experiment, a strange, heavily modified version of the B-17 called the YB-40. At first glance, it looked like any other bomber. But this machine was something different, a flying gunship designed to escort regular bombers to their targets and back, bristling with extra armor and as many as 14.50 caliber machine guns. The idea was simple: if fighters were cutting down bombers before they reached their targets, why not turn a bomber into a gun platform so powerful that it could defend the others? The YB-40 would prove to be both a failure and a revelation. When it first took flight in 1943, it carried additional ammunition, gun turrets, and reinforced armor plates. It had a chin turret under the nose to counter head-on attacks, twin top turrets, and improved waist gun positions. But the extra weight meant it was slower, so slow, in fact, that after dropping bombs, the standard B-17s could outpace their would-be protector on the way home. The concept was flawed. But during its brief time in combat, the YB-40 revealed something extraordinary, something that would change the B-17 forever. Crews flying the YB-40 noticed that the new, staggered waist gun positions, where one window was moved slightly forward, and the opposite window slightly backward, allowed both gunners to fire simultaneously without interfering with each other. It was a simple, almost laughably small change, just a few feet difference, but it completely transformed the bomber's defensive capability. No more bumping elbows. No more waiting for your partner to stop shooting. Now, for the first time, both waist gunners could lay down intersecting streams of fire against incoming fighters. That small observation, made by exhausted crews in the middle of a desperate war, would go on to save thousands of American lives. Engineers took the lesson to heart. They redesigned the next model of the B17, known as the B17G, incorporating the staggered waist windows, along with the new Cheyenne tail turret and chin gun modifications. What had started as a failed experiment had evolved into the most survivable bomber of the entire war. But in early 1943, none of that was known yet. To the men of the 8th Air Force stationed at bases like Bassingbourn, Thorpe Abbotts, and Kimbolton, the future seemed uncertain. Each mission briefing could be their last. The names Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and Bremen were whispered with dread. And every time they climbed aboard their aircraft, Memphis Belle, Ye Old Pub, Misbehavin', Heavenly Body, they did so knowing that only luck and teamwork stood between them and the black plumes of flak rising from below. What they didn't know was that change was coming. And that change, born from field reports, desperate innovation, and the courage of those who refused to quit, would soon turn the tide of the air war over Europe. The transformation of the B-17 had begun. By the spring of 1943, the United States Army Air Forces were desperate. Every daylight raid over Germany was a gamble with death. Luftwaffe pilots, seasoned veterans flying Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, had learned the weaknesses of the flying fortress, and they exploited them with surgical precision. They didn't always come from the front or rear. No, the Germans began sweeping in from the sides, high-speed passes at 3 or 9 o'clock, slicing through formations and vanishing into cloud banks before American gunners could even react. Waist gunners, those two brave souls standing in the belly of the B-17, were supposed to be the fortress's guardians against these attacks. Instead, they were victims of poor design and worse luck. When the idea of the YB-40 gunship first surfaced, it sounded like a miracle solution. The logic was straightforward: if bombers were too vulnerable on the way to the target, why not create a version so heavily armed it could escort the others? The Allies had no long-range fighters yet. The P-51 Mustang's full potential was still months away. The P-47 Thunderbolt and P-38 Lightning could only stay with the bombers partway. The result? Long, unprotected stretches of sky where the Luftwaffe owned the air. So engineers at Vega, a division of Lockheed, took the standard B-17F airframe and began to reshape it into something extraordinary. They added a chin turret beneath the nose, a twin-gun pod that gave the bomber, for the first time, real protection against frontal attacks. They added a second dorsal turret, extra ammunition boxes, heavier armor plating, and most importantly, re-engineered the waist gun positions. Instead of keeping the two gun ports directly opposite each other, they staggered them, offsetting the right side window slightly forward and the left side window slightly aft. The modification wasn't born from theory, it was born from the complaints of real gunners who had nearly shot each other to death. When the first YB-40s arrived in England in the spring of 1943, they caused a sensation among aircrews. The planes looked meaner, bristling with machine gun barrels, their sides bulging with ammo belts. Crews nicknamed them Flying Porcupines. In May, they joined their first combat mission, a raid on Saint-Nazaire, the notorious submarine pens on the French Atlantic coast. From the start, the results were mixed. The YB-40s could defend themselves brilliantly. Their gunners claimed multiple kills on German fighters, and the extra firepower made them almost untouchable when attacked directly. But there was one problem: weight. With all the added armor, ammunition, and guns, the YB-40 was nearly 4,000 pounds heavier than a standard B-17. Once the rest of the formation dropped its bombs and lightened its load, the YB-40s simply couldn't keep up. They fell behind on the return flight, and instead of protecting others, they became isolated targets. It was a bitter irony. The very bomber built to defend the group often ended up flying home alone. By the time the project was quietly shelved a few months later, only about 24 YB-40s had been built. To the casual observer, the experiment was a failure. But to historians, and especially to those who flew the real missions, the YB-40 left behind something priceless: knowledge. In its design, engineers had unintentionally solved several of the B-17's worst defensive problems. The chin turret introduced on the YB-40 became one of the defining features of the later B-17G model, finally giving the Fortress the ability to shoot down enemy fighters coming head-on. The Cheyenne tail turret, another modification tested around the same time, improved the tail gunner's field of fire. And most importantly, that simple staggering of the waist gun positions, just a few feet of spacing between two tiny windows, changed everything for the men inside. To understand how dramatic that change was, you have to imagine what it was like before. Inside the B-17's fuselage, space was almost non-existent. The waist gunners stood opposite each other, wedged between bulkheads, oxygen bottles, and ammunition boxes. Each man wore heavy flak vests, bulky heated suits, and oxygen masks. The roar of the engines and the rattle of .50 caliber fire created a deafening storm. When both gunners tried to engage targets simultaneously, their elbows collided, their guns jammed, and spent brass casings sprayed across the floor, burning holes in flight suits. Many veterans recalled moments when, in the chaos, their own guns clashed, or worse, when they had to stop firing to avoid injuring their crewmate. That hesitation, that human bottleneck, cost lives. German pilots learned to exploit it. They'd coordinate side attacks, knowing the American gunners couldn't both fire effectively. In some missions, after the battle was over, officers found aircraft with both waist windows scorched, proof that both men had fired at once, but too late to stop the fatal attack. When the staggered waist position appeared, everything changed. Suddenly, each gunner had room to operate independently. Their firing arcs overlapped, creating a deadly crossfire zone. No longer did they have to coordinate or take turns, they could both unleash their weapons at once. It might sound trivial, but in air combat, seconds determine survival. The difference between one gun and two firing simultaneously could mean the difference between a crippled bomber limping home or 1,000 gallons of aviation fuel exploding midair. It wasn't long before reports began filtering back to the U.S. Army Air Force's design teams. Aircraft with staggered waist windows were seeing significantly fewer losses in side attacks. Engineers at Boeing and Lockheed took notice. They began implementing the staggered configuration on all future B-17s, starting with the B-17G series, the final and most advanced version of the Fortress. But the story didn't end there. The lessons from the YB-40 were more than just technical, they were cultural. They represented a shift in philosophy, from top-down engineering to bottom-up innovation. Instead of dictating design from headquarters, the U.S. military began listening to the men who actually fought the war. They realized that combat experience, the kind that came from sweating and bleeding at 25,000 feet, was more valuable than any engineering theory. This new philosophy began shaping not just the B-17 but the entire American air arsenal. The B-24 Liberator, for example, received similar defensive improvements after field reports highlighted its own vulnerabilities. And when the B-29 Superfortress was being developed, designers incorporated modular gun turrets and improved crew ergonomics based on hard-won experience from Europe. Still, the B-17G would become the crown jewel of this transformation. It combined everything learned from years of combat: chin turret, Cheyenne tail, staggered waist windows, stronger ball turret, improved armor, into a single, deadly efficient machine. For the first time, bomber crews began feeling that maybe, just maybe, they had a fighting chance. Statistics proved it. By late 1944, loss rates among B B-17G units had dropped by nearly 40% compared to early 1943. Missions that once saw entire squadrons wiped out were now returning with most aircraft intact. The Flying Fortress had finally earned its name. To the men who flew it, these changes weren't abstract numbers. They were the difference between life and death, between seeing another sunrise or being remembered on a memorial wall. Veterans later spoke of how the new waist layout made them feel more in control, more confident. They could track incoming fighters more easily, coordinate with the ball turret below, and maintain overlapping zones of fire. The fortress had become what it was always meant to be, not just a bomber, but a fortress in the sky. As the war dragged on, the Luftwaffe found itself increasingly overwhelmed. Its veteran pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced, and the improved defenses of the B-17G only accelerated that decline. By the time of the great raids on Berlin and Dresden, the skies were filled with fortresses that looked much the same as before, but inside, they were completely different machines. The simple act of shifting two gun windows had rippled across the entire air war. It's easy to romanticize innovation, to imagine breakthroughs happening in clean laboratories or brilliant flashes of genius. But in truth, many of the most important innovations of World War II came from desperation, from soldiers and airmen forced to adapt or die. The staggered waist window was one of those moments, born not from science, but from survival. So when historians talk about the B-17 as the aircraft that won the air war over Europe, they aren't just referring to its bombs or its engines. They're talking about the courage of the men who flew it, the engineers who listened to them, and the tiny adjustments that turned tragedy into triumph. The YB-40 might have been a failure on paper, but its legacy was written in lives saved, and in the countless fortresses that returned home when, by all rights, they shouldn't have. By the end of 1943, something was changing in the cold, hostile skies over Europe. The same formations that once bled away man after man were beginning to hold their ground. The B-17G had arrived, and with it came an attitude shift that spread through every airfield in England. Crews still climbed aboard their bombers knowing the odds, but now there was a flicker of hope, a sense that maybe the fortress finally deserved its name. When those new models rolled onto the hardstands at places like Kimbolton, Thorpe Abbotts, and Bassingbourn, even veterans could feel the difference. The chin turret gave the ship a fierce new face. The Cheyenne tail allowed the rear gunner to sweep a wide arc that no fighter could slip through. Inside, the staggered waist guns stood ready, each with its own clear field of fire. The plane still rattled, still leaked hydraulic fluid, still stank of gun oil and fear, but it was faster, deadlier, and tougher than anything the Luftwaffe had faced before. The first real test came during the great raids of late 43, missions with names that would be etched into the history of air warfare: Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and Bremen. On those days the air over Germany became a crucible of flame and metal. Hundreds of B-17s crossed the channel in tight, glittering formations, contrails weaving like white scars across the blue. From the ground, civilians watched in awe; from above, the gunners watched death rising to meet them. German commanders had spent the summer studying the American formations. They knew exactly where to strike, head-on for the pilots, from below for the bomb bays, and from the sides to shred the vulnerable midsection. But when they met the B-17G, they discovered a very different opponent. The side attacks that had once guaranteed easy kills were suddenly suicidal. Twin streams of .50 caliber fire reached out from the staggered windows, crisscrossing in a curtain of tracers. Fighters diving in at the 9 o'clock position were ripped apart before they could line up a shot. For the first time, Luftwaffe pilots began reporting formations that were impenetrable. Yet the cost was still brutal. On Black Thursday, October 14, 1943, when American bombers returned to Schweinfurt for a second strike on the ball-bearing factories, 60 out of 291 never came home. It was one of the darkest days of the air campaign. But buried inside that nightmare was a revelation: aircraft equipped with the new defensive layout, including the staggered guns, were surviving at measurably higher rates. Out of the wreckage, statisticians began to see patterns, small but undeniable improvements that meant lives. Back in England, engineers pored over every report. They measured bullet holes, traced impact angles, and interviewed shaken survivors. The evidence was clear: overlapping fire from the staggered guns cut side attack effectiveness by roughly a third. Combined with the chin and tail turrets, the B17G reduced total combat losses by nearly 40% compared with the old F models. For the men in the air, statistics didn't matter. What mattered was that they could finally fight back. Waist gunners now shouted over the interphone, "I've got him, he's mine," instead of, "Hold your fire." The difference in morale was electric. Crews began painting fresh nose art: "Fightin' Lady," "Lucky 7," "Old Crow's Nest," symbols of a confidence that had been missing for far too long. The Germans noticed it too. Reports from Jägerschwader 26 and 54 spoke of "fortresses that shoot in every direction." Veteran Luftwaffe aces like Walter Osaw and Egon Mayer started developing desperate counter-tactics, high-speed vertical attacks and head-on passes designed to exploit the brief blind spot under the nose. But even that advantage vanished once the chin turret proved its worth. Every new American modification forced the Luftwaffe to adapt, stretching its resources thinner and thinner. By early 1944, those skies once ruled by German fighters were changing hands. The B-17G formations, now escorted partway by improved P-47s and soon by long-range P-51 Mustangs, pushed deeper into the Reich. The daylight bombing strategy that once seemed doomed was finally working. Still, victory didn't come cheap. Even with all the improvements, losses remained staggering by modern standards: 12,000 bombers gone by war's end, 80,000 airmen killed or captured. But compared to the slaughter of early 1943, it was a miracle of survival, and it started with one subtle change: a 3-foot offset between two windows. As one veteran gunner, Staff Sergeant Ed McLean of the 91st Bomb Group, later said, "We didn't think about engineering. We just knew we could both shoot now, and that meant we might live to land." By the dawn of 1944, the air war over Europe had become a test of endurance: industrial, mechanical, and human. Every morning the English countryside shook beneath the roar of 1,000 engines as silver bombers lifted into a pale sky, their contrails weaving into endless white highways that stretched toward the heart of the Reich. Inside those planes sat boys who had now become veterans, hardened by fear, sustained by habit. They knew the drill: climb to 25,000 feet, hold formation, trust the man beside you, and pray that today's run wasn't your last. But something was different now. The formations no longer looked like victims, they looked like an army in the air. Each fortress carried the scars of past battles, patched bullet holes, scorched paint, but also the latest refinements born from months of brutal learning. The staggered waist guns stitched a continuous web of fire down each flank, the chin turret spat flame at anything daring a frontal attack, and the Cheyenne tail kept predators from sneaking in from behind. For the first time since the bombing campaign began, the U.S. 8th Air Force was punching its way across Germany and coming back with most of its crews alive. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe's skies, was beginning to bleed out. Pilots who had survived since 1940 were now dying faster than they could be replaced. Fuel shortages, Allied attacks on aircraft factories, and endless raids were crippling Germany's ability to fight. Still, they came, squadrons of FW-190s and Bf-109s, their yellow-nosed leaders diving through the contrails in desperate bursts of courage. Over Leipzig, Brunswick, and Frankfurt they met the reforged fortresses head-on, and paid for it. Gun camera footage showed fighters exploding mid-air, disintegrating under a storm of tracers. One Luftwaffe ace reportedly muttered after bailing out, "These bombers shoot in every direction. They are no longer prey, they are predators." Inside the bombers, life was still a frozen hell. Oxygen masks crusted with ice, guns seized from the cold, and flak shells burst like black flowers all around. Yet there was rhythm now, discipline born of survival. Waist gunners called their sectors, 3 o'clock low. And both guns roared without fear of collision. The staggered layout let them work like twin gears in a single machine. Pilots trusted their crews, crews trusted their fortress. Confidence, once the rarest commodity in the 8th Air Force, had returned. Then came Big Week, February 1944, a coordinated assault on Germany's aircraft industry that would decide the fate of the air war. For 6 straight days, B-17 GS and B-24s smashed factories at Regensburg, Gotha, Augsburg, and Leipzig. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had left into the fray. The skies became a storm of steel, black flak bursts, tracer streams, and tumbling wrecks. But this time the balance tipped. The improved defensive firepower of the B-17G formations broke the German attacks apart. Each time the fighters massed for a side sweep, they met intersecting torrents from the staggered waist guns. Every few seconds another German machine fell burning through its own contrail. By the end of Big Week, Germany had lost more than 300 experienced pilots, a blow from which its fighter arm would never recover. American losses were heavy, but the statistics told the truth. The new fortresses were surviving missions that would have been massacres only a year before. Combat analysts estimated that side attack effectiveness had dropped by nearly 40% since the staggered window design became standard. The Cheyenne tail and chin turrets accounted for dozens of confirmed kills, but the waist gun change, so small, so simple, had quietly become one of the most successful defensive improvements of the entire war. With the Luftwaffe reeling, the Allies turned toward the ultimate prize, Berlin. In March 1944, hundreds of B-17 GS thundered eastward under the first full Mustang escort. It was a moment heavy with symbolism. The bombers that had once limped home alone were now spearheading the destruction of the Nazi war machine. As they crossed into German airspace, radar screens in Berlin lit up like Christmas trees. Fighters scrambled, flak towers spun their barrels skyward, and the capital braced for a daylight assault it had been told was impossible. What followed was one of the most dramatic aerial battles of the Second World War. Waves of FW-190s clawed into the formations, cannon shells tearing through aluminum skins. But the fortresses held. Side attacks were met by perfectly synchronized bursts from both waist guns, streams of tracers weaving together in lethal harmony. Dozens of German fighters went down in flames. For hours the battle raged, until the bomb doors opened and Berlin itself disappeared beneath a rolling sea of explosions. The myth of the untouchable German heartland had been shattered, and the weapon that made it possible was not just firepower, but design born from experience. When the formations limped back to England that evening, ground crews counted holes, patched wings, and tallied losses. They were high, yes, but far below what anyone had dared hope. The fortresses had proven they could reach Berlin in daylight and return. The once fatal flaw that made gunners fight each other instead of the enemy had been erased from history. As the smoke of the Berlin raids drifted eastward, the men of the 8th Air Force finally felt the shift they had been fighting for since 1942. The fortress, reborn through fire and ingenuity, was now the hammer striking at the heart of Nazi industry. Each new mission carried the same risk, the same fear, but it also carried momentum. The Luftwaffe was breaking. Its replacement pilots were barely trained, its fuel reserves evaporating, its morale in freefall. And through that disintegrating sky came the endless drone of B-17 GS, silver specks in the sun, steady, relentless, unstoppable. By mid-1944, every major German city lay within reach. The bombers hit rail yards, oil plants, ball-bearing factories, every artery that kept the Reich alive. The improved defenses allowed formations to stay tighter, more disciplined, and to press deeper into enemy territory. Where once single-engine fighters could tear through the columns, now they met walls of interlocking fire. The staggered waist guns, the chin and tail turrets, and the constant escort of P-51 Mustangs formed a fortress within a fortress. Gunners began counting their victories in dozens. Some crews reported shooting down 6 or 7 fighters in a single mission. But inside those victories lay an unspoken price. Every mission still meant friends who didn't return. Even with the modifications, flak remained merciless, and a single lucky burst could rip open a fuel tank or sever a wing. Veterans learned not to look too long at the empty bunks each night. Yet amid the grief grew a fierce pride, they were part of something that worked. The fortress was no longer a death trap, it was a machine that gave them a chance, a fighting chance, to finish the job and come home. In July 1944 the Allied invasion of France changed everything. Now the bombers could fly from captured airfields on the continent, striking targets that had once been beyond reach. The B-17Gs operated in waves so vast that German civilians called them der Teppich, the carpet. The sound of their engines became the soundtrack of defeat. For the Luftwaffe, each engagement was suicide. Commanders begged for time, for fuel, for replacements, but none came. American radar-directed formations, guided by experienced crews and fortified by those small yet vital improvements, simply overwhelmed the defenders. By early 1945, the B-17G had become more than a bomber, it was a symbol. Photographs of endless formations over the Rhine, sunlight flashing off their aluminum skins, filled newspapers around the world. To Allied troops fighting on the ground, the low growl of those engines meant salvation. To the Germans, it meant the end. And to the men inside, it meant history was being written with every pull of a trigger. When victory finally came that May, few outside the service understood how close the Daylight campaign had come to collapse 2 years earlier, or how a handful of field-borne ideas had saved it. The simple act of staggering 2 windows by 3 feet had rewritten the calculus of survival. In engineering drawings it was a trivial note, in human terms, it was the difference between an airman making it home or vanishing in smoke above Schweinfurt. After the war, historians combed through records, combat reports, and interviews. The numbers told a quiet truth. B-17 crews in the final 18 months of the conflict faced casualty rates roughly 40% lower than those in 1943. The most successful defensive modifications, the chin turret, the Cheyenne tail, and the staggered waist guns, were cited again and again as decisive. What had started as improvisation under fire became doctrine for every bomber that followed. The B-29 Superfortress, the B-36 Peacemaker, and even the jet-age B-52 owed part of their design lineage to lessons learned by freezing, terrified men in the waste of a B-17 over Germany. For the survivors, the transformation of their aircraft became a metaphor for the war itself, brutal mistakes turned into hard-won wisdom. They had begun as untested kids flying machines built by theory, they ended as veterans flying machines built by experience. And when they looked at the sleek, late-war fortress sitting quiet on the tarmac, they knew its every curve, every rivet, every offset window carried the story of lives lost and lessons learned. The B-17 had come full circle, from an optimistic prototype to a flawed giant to a true fortress of the skies. Its evolution proved a timeless truth. In war, survival often depends not on grand inventions, but on the smallest adjustments born from courage and necessity. When the guns finally fell silent in Europe in May 1945, the B-17 Flying Fortress stood as both a monument and a memory. Thousands of them lined the airfields of England, wings drooping, paint scorched, metal patched and scarred from years of unrelenting combat. To the crews who had flown them, they were not machines, they were living companions. Every dent, every bullet hole, every faded name painted on the nose told a story of courage, fear, and survival. In the calm after the storm, those men walked among their aircraft with the quiet reverence of soldiers visiting the graves of fallen friends. For the engineers back home, the B-17's journey was the ultimate lesson in humility. The aircraft that had begun as a carefully planned masterpiece of aeronautical design had evolved into a survivor's creation, its final, most effective form shaped not by blueprints or committees, but by the blood and experience of the men who flew it. The change in the waist windows, the addition of the chin turret, the reinforced tail section, each modification represented the translation of battlefield pain into engineering wisdom. The war had forced a new kind of design philosophy, one that listened to those on the front lines instead of the drawing board. In post-war interviews, many Boeing engineers admitted that the combat classroom of the 8th Air Force taught them more about aircraft design than any textbook ever could. The YB-40 experiment, which had failed spectacularly as an escort gunship, was re-examined not as a disaster but as a discovery. It had exposed weaknesses that would have otherwise continued to kill. The cramped waist section, the overlapping fields of fire, the lack of lateral visibility, all revealed through real combat experience. The men who had flown those heavy, gun-laden prototypes had unknowingly saved thousands of their comrades by proving what didn't work. By 1945, those lessons had reshaped American aviation doctrine. The Air Force realized that war fighters had to be active participants in the evolution of their machines. Feedback loops between frontline crews and manufacturers became standard. The B-29 Superfortress would benefit directly from this approach, integrating advanced gun control systems and ergonomic crew spaces designed with veteran input. In a very real sense, every modern bomber, from the sleek B-2 Spirit to the hypersonic projects of the future, carries the DNA of those wartime conversations between frightened young airmen and the engineers who listened to them. Yet for all the technological progress, the heart of the B-17 story remained human. Veterans remembered the bitter cold of the high-altitude missions, the way frost crept across their oxygen masks, the sound of machine guns echoing through the fuselage, the smell of burnt hydraulic fluid and cordite. They remembered the empty seats at breakfast after a mission that went wrong. They remembered the strange silence that followed landing, when engines shut down and only the ticking of cooling metal filled the air. Many said the plane felt alive, that it seemed to carry them through when nothing else could. And perhaps it did. For those men, survival was a kind of miracle, a fragile thread woven from steel, courage, and a few inches of staggered aluminum. In the years that followed, the B-17 faded from the skies but not from memory. Thousands were scrapped, cut into pieces in quiet airfields, melted down into the raw material of a world rebuilt from ruin. Yet a few survived, flown home for war bond tours, displayed at airshows, preserved by museums, or lovingly restored by veterans who couldn't bear to let them go. Each surviving fortress became a shrine to the era it had defined. When people stood beneath their wings, they could still smell the faint odor of oil and hear, in imagination, the distant growl of 4 Wright Cyclone engines. Hollywood, too, would immortalize the B-17. Films like 12 O'Clock High captured not only the machinery but the psychology of those who flew it, the tension between bravery and fear, the invisible weight carried by men who faced death daily. To audiences around the world, the B-17 became the visual symbol of American persistence, the embodiment of a nation that refused to surrender even when the odds seemed impossible. But beyond its fame, the true legacy of the B-17 lay in its quiet influence on generations of aviators and engineers. Every lesson learned over the skies of Germany became a building block for the future: self-sealing fuel tanks, staggered crew positions, armor placement, redundant control systems, and the understanding that human factors were just as critical as horsepower. The very concept of survivability in modern aircraft design, balancing offensive power with crew protection, was born inside the aluminum fuselage of the Flying Fortress. Even decades later, the lessons of 1943 echoed in military classrooms. Air Force cadets studying systems design would analyze the waist gunner interference problem as a case study in human-machine interaction. They learned that sometimes the smallest ergonomic oversight, a few inches of window alignment, could determine life or death. It was a story that transcended its time, teaching future engineers that every bolt and bracket carried moral weight. The B-17 wasn't just an airplane, it was a moral equation written in metal. As the Cold War dawned, a handful of B-17s continued to serve quietly in reconnaissance and rescue roles. Their familiar silhouette could be seen patrolling coastlines, mapping terrain, or searching for lost aircraft. They had become ghosts of an earlier age, symbols of endurance in a world racing toward supersonic speed. By the 1960s, most were gone, but a few continued to fly in the hands of private collectors and historical groups. Each time one took to the air, veterans gathered to watch, their eyes misting as the old engines roared to life. For them, the sound wasn't noise, it was memory. In museums across the world, from the Imperial War Museum in Duxford to the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force in Dayton, visitors still stand in awe beneath the wings of restored fortresses. Children gaze up at the massive bomb bays, parents trace the names painted on the nose art, and guides tell stories of the men who once filled those narrow spaces. Some touch the staggered waste windows and marvel that such a simple change could have saved so many lives. It's a tangible reminder that progress is often made not in leaps, but in steps, small, deliberate, human steps. For historians, the B-17's evolution remains one of the most remarkable case studies in wartime adaptation. It demonstrated how an industrial power, faced with catastrophic losses, could reinvent its own designs in real time. The staggering of those gun windows, the strengthening of the tail assembly, the integration of new turrets, each represented the triumph of feedback over pride, of practical wisdom over theoretical perfection. The B-17 taught America how to listen, adapt, and innovate under pressure, a lesson that would serve it well through the rest of the 20th century. And so, the legend endures. Every airshow flight, every museum exhibit, every echo of those rumbling engines keeps alive the spirit of the men who flew them. They were ordinary boys thrust into extraordinary circumstances, farmers, clerks, mechanics, who learned to face death at 20,000 feet and, through their courage, reshaped aviation itself. Their plane, flawed and heroic, became the very image of resilience. Today, when historians speak of the arsenal of democracy, they speak not only of factories and blueprints but of the human collaboration that turned those resources into survival. The B-17 story reminds us that greatness is rarely born in perfection, it's forged in failure, corrected by loss, and refined by experience. It reminds us that sometimes, the difference between disaster and victory is as simple as moving a window 3 feet to the left. As the last surviving fortresses continue to fly, slow, majestic, defying time, they carry more than their crews ever imagined. They carry the memory of every man who didn't come home, the wisdom of those who did, and the enduring belief that innovation guided by compassion can change the world. The skies they once filled with smoke and thunder are now peaceful, but when a B-17 passes overhead, its shadow still whispers of courage. And that is the legacy of the Flying Fortress, a machine reborn through sacrifice, a story written not in blueprints but in blood, and a reminder that even in the darkest hours of war, human ingenuity and brotherhood can turn tragedy into triumph.